So to start off today, I want you to imagine that you are hiking through this incredibly dense, lush mountain forest.
Oh, sounds nice.
Right. It's beautiful. You step over a mossy log, you look down at the damp earth, and you spot this small, dark amphibian. It's a Caucasian salamander.
Okay, a salamander, very specific,
Yeah, and it looks ordinary enough, but there is a massive catch.
which is,
Well, by all the laws of planetary climate history, this creature, and honestly the entire forest you are walking through, should have been completely wiped off the face of the earth.
right, wiped out by a mile-thick sheet of ice.
Exactly, hundreds of thousands of years ago, yet, here it is, just thriving. So welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are exploring this absolute geographic fortress that makes anomalies like that possible.
It is a truly wild region.
It really is. We have a massive stack of sources today. Encyclopedia entries, historical records, ecological surveys, all covering the Caucasus. It's a region that basically bisects Eastern Europe and Western Asia.
And for our mission today, we are trying to figure out how this one specific mountain range acts as Eurasia's ultimate vault.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're looking at a place that has physically trapped and preserved, well, ancient human ancestors, completely isolated languages.
Mirrored mythologies, too,
Right. And even, like you said, prehistoric ecosystems.
is the ultimate vault because it is quite literally a massive natural wall.
Yeah.
I mean, geographically, the region is dominated by the greater and lesser Caucasus mountain ranges.
And they stretch directly between two seas, right?
Yeah, exactly. From the Black Sea on the west, straight across to the Caspian Sea on the east. And to really grasp the sheer vertical scale we are talking about here, you just have to look at Mount Elbrus.
Oh, Mount Elbrus is just staggering.
It really is. It sits near the modern Russian-Georgian border, and at 5,642 meters, it is the highest peak in Europe.
Wow, so it completely dwarfs the Alps.
Oh, easily. It is this towering, dormant volcano, just entirely encased in glaciers.
And it's so imposing that even the very names given to it by early peoples tell you exactly how hostile this environment was.
The etymology is fascinating.
Right. Like Pliny the Elder, the Roman author, he noted that the name derives from a Scythian word meaning shimmering with snow.
And you have to remember who the Scythians were.
Yeah, they were these hardened, nomadic, horseback warriors of the Eurasian steppe. So if a mountain range makes them stop and say, wow, look at all that ice, you know it's a formidable barrier.
Exactly. And then you also have a Latvian root word that translates the concept to frozen mud.
Frozen mud. Just so bleak.
It is. You get this immediate picture of this beautiful but just almost impassable frozen frontier.
Impassable is a great word for it. It kind of makes me think of ancient map makers, you know? Like when they reached the edge of the known world, they would just draw sea monsters. How did ancient people make sense of this massive icy wall?
Well, when ancient civilizations encountered an impassable physical barrier like that, they didn't just map it. They mythologized it.
Of course.
Because human psychology kind of dictates that whatever we cannot conquer, we weave into our cosmology. So for the ancient Greeks navigating the eastern edges of the Black Sea, the Caucasus Mountains literally looked like a wall holding up the sky.
So it became exactly that in their stories.
Right. It became one of the pillars supporting the world. It was the absolute edge of human reality for them.
And because it was so remote and terrifying, wasn't this the exact location where Zeus chained the Titan Prometheus?
Yes. Chained him to a rock and left an eagle to eat his liver every single day.
Brutal. And all as punishment for giving humanity the secret of fire.
It's a heavy myth. But it wasn't just the Greeks projecting their fears onto this wall. The Persian empires to the south did the exact same thing.
With Mount Kaf, right.
Exactly. In Persian lore, this region is tied to Mount Kaf. It's this legendary, mysterious peak that supposedly surrounds the entire known world.
Basically the boundary line between the realm of humans and the realm of the totally unknown.
Yep. But the dynamic here is much more complex than just outside empires looking at the mountains and telling stories about them.
Because the people living inside the mountains had their own stories.
Exactly. When you look at the highly localized folklore of the people who actually lived inside the Caucasus, specifically these oral traditions known as the Nart sagas, the parallels to outside mythology are just staggering.
The Nart sagas are wild. They chronicle this ancient race of heroes, And one of the central figures is this shape-shifting trickster named Sosrukwo.
Sosrukwo, right.
And according to the legend, he was born burning in flames, so a blacksmith god had to dip him in magic water to make his body invulnerable to weapons.
But there's a catch.
There's always a catch. To dip him, the god had to hold him by the knees with a pair of tongs. So Sosrukwo is completely invincible except for that one tiny spot where the tongs gripped his legs.
I mean, he is essentially the Greek hero Achilles.
Exactly, right down to the fatal weakness in the lower leg.
And the crossover doesn't stop there. There are specific Georgian folktales about two brothers who were taken prisoner by a massive one-eyed giant who herds sheep.
Okay, I think I know where this is going.
Right. So to escape, the brothers heat up a spit in the fire, stab the giant in his single eye, and flee.
If you have ever read Homer's Odyssey, that is practically a carbon copy of Odysseus escaping the Cyclops, Polyphemus.
It is nearly identical.
Okay, wait. I have to push back here. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because Jason and the Argonauts sailing to Colchis, Odysseus fighting the Cyclops, Achilles and his heel, these are like the foundational texts of Western civilization.
They absolutely are.
So are we saying the Greeks imported the core of their heroic mythology from a Georgian mountain valley? Or did the Greeks just, I don't know, force their stories onto the mountain tribes?
It's a fantastic question, and it really speaks to the mechanics of ancient trade.
How so?
Well, we tend to think of the ancient world as super disconnected, but the Black Sea was actually an incredibly active maritime highway.
Oh, right. Lots of ships going back and forth.
Exactly. Greek sailors and merchants were constantly interacting with the coastal peoples of the Caucasus. What we are likely seeing isn't a one-way street of copying, but a cultural feedback loop.
A feedback loop. So like a Greek sailor trades some bronze goods for Caucasian gold or timber.
They sit around a fire at night.
And they just swap stories.
Exactly. They swap stories about giants and invincible warriors. And over centuries, those stories blend together. The mountains were a wall, yes, but the valleys that opened up to the sea acted as this amazing mixing bowl for the people who managed to navigate them.
Wow. And that mixing bowl effect wasn't just catching ancient sailors. Because long before the Greeks or Persians even existed, this physical barrier captured the earliest known human ancestors.
Yes, the literal vault of human history.
We have to talk about the Dmanisi archaeological site in Georgia because the numbers here are almost hard to comprehend.
They really are. Back in the early 1990s, archaeologists at Dmanisi uncovered hominin fossils, specifically a subspecies classified as Homo erectus georgicus.
And how old are these?
These fossils date back 1.8 million years.
1.8 million years. I mean, to put that in perspective for you, the listener, modern Homo sapiens, our species, we have only been around for roughly 300,000 years.
It's a massive time gap.
It is.
Yeah.
So what were these early hominins doing all the way up in the Caucasus?
They were migrating.
Yeah.
I mean, these are the 5 oldest unequivocal hominin skulls ever found anywhere outside of the African continent.
Wow. Anywhere.
Yes. For a long time, we really didn't fully understand how or when early humans moved into Eurasia. But the Dmanisi find provides the mechanism.
So the mountains guided them.
Exactly. As these early populations moved north out of the Levant, the massive physical barrier of the Caucasus acted as a geographic funnel. It essentially guided them into these specific, highly hospitable valleys.
And what absolutely blows my mind is that this geographic funnel, this vault, it just kept doing its job for the next 2 million years.
It never stopped.
If you look at the demographic map of the region today, it is arguably the most complex tapestry of human diversity on the entire planet.
Oh, without a doubt. There are more than 50 distinct ethnic groups living in the Caucasus today.
And the languages. We aren't just talking about slightly different dialects of the same root language here.
No, not at all.
The sources highlight no fewer than 3 entirely unique language families indigenous strictly to this area. You have the Kardvelian, the Northwest Caucasian, and the Northeast Caucasian families, all just existing right alongside Indo-European and Turkic languages.
What's fascinating here is the underlying mechanism of that diversity.
Yeah.
I mean, why are there 3 completely unique language families here when entire continents are often dominated by just 1 or 2?
Right, like how Indo-European just blanketed Europe.
Exactly. It all comes down to the friction of the terrain. Consider how linguistic homogenization usually happens. An empire with a strong military rolls across a flat steppe or a river valley. They conquer the inhabitants, and they enforce a single language and legal code.
But you can't exactly just roll a chariot or a tank column across the Greater Caucasus.
Precisely. The valleys are so deep, The ridges are so jagged and the winters are so severe that human populations became hyper-isolated.
So they were just cut off.
Completely. A group of people could live in one valley for 5,000 years, developing their own entirely unique language and culture, completely cut off from another group living just, say, 20 miles away on the other side of a ridge.
That is wild. It's almost like a massive acoustic foam room.
Ooh, I like that comparison.
You know how sound studios have those deep, jagged foam wedges on the walls?
Yeah, to kill the echoes.
Right, they trap the sound waves so they don't bounce around and muddy the audio. The Caucasus is basically a geographic acoustic foam room.
That's a great way to put it.
Tribes, languages, and cultures enter, but instead of blending together into one giant unified noise or empire, they get trapped in these separate, deep mountain pockets. They just survive, perfectly intact, side by side for millennia.
That acoustic foam effect is brilliant for preserving human heritage. But if we connect this to the bigger geopolitical picture, that exact same isolation is a tragic double-edged sword.
Because they can't unite.
Partly, yes. When a valley allows a population to develop a fiercely independent, highly localized identity over thousands of years, they become incredibly resistant to outside assimilation.
Which makes them a target.
Exactly. And if that valley happens to sit squarely on the most strategically vital real estate in Eurasia, that localized independence puts a massive target on their backs.
Which explains why this vault inevitably became one of the bloodiest battlegrounds in human history. To really understand why empires cared so much about these mountains, you just have to look at the map.
Geography is destiny.
It is. The Caucasus is the only land bridge between the Black and Caspian Seas.
Right.
If you are an empire to the north, like Russia, and you want access to the warm water ports and trade routes of the Middle East, you have to go through the Caucasus.
And the reverse is true.
Right. If you are an empire to the south, like the Persians or the Ottomans, and you want to push into Europe or the Eurasian steppe, you have to go through the Caucasus.
It is the ultimate geographic choke point.
Ye-
You cannot simply bypass it. You either control the mountain passes, like the famous Darial Gorge, or you leave the soft underbelly of your empire completely exposed to invasion.
So what does this all mean for the people actually living there? Because before we dive into the history here, I want to say to you, the listener, we are about to cover some intense and politically charged historical conflicts involving multiple nations and ideologies.
Very heavy history.
Yes. And our goal is absolutely not to take a side or endorse any specific viewpoint. We are purely here to share the factual historical record contained in our sources so you can understand the region's current complexities.
That's a very important distinction. Because of that brutal geographic calculus we mentioned, the region was subjected to a relentless conveyor belt of conquests.
Just one after another.
Oh, yeah. The Romans fought to set up provinces in western Georgia. Then came the Sassanids, the last major pre-Islamic Persian empire, who battled the Byzantines for control.
And then the Arabs arrived, right?
Yes, in the 7th century, Arab armies arrived, pushing through the passes and introducing Islam to the region. Later, the Ottoman Empire and various Turco-Mongol conquerors swept through. And then eventually you have the aggressive southern expansion of the Russian Empire of the 19th century.
Just looking at the historical record in our sources, the human cost of being a choke point is, well, it's just devastating.
It is truly heartbreaking.
We're looking at centuries of overlapping claims, shifting borders, and massive human tragedy. The geography protected these cultures, but it also trapped them in the crossfire of superpowers.
The 19th and 20th centuries were particularly catastrophic, as the Russian Empire sought to definitively secure its southern borders and control the Black Sea coast during the Caucasian Wars. The texts document the resulting ethnic cleansing of the indigenous Circassian population.
And that was a massive expulsion.
Huge. Hundreds of thousands of North Caucasian Muslims were systematically expelled from their ancestral valleys and forced to flee across the Black Sea as refugees into the Ottoman Empire. And there was massive loss of life along the way.
And the tragedies really just compounded as empires collapsed and reformed.
They did.
During World War I, the region became a primary theater for the horrors of the Armenian genocide, where the Ottoman government systematically deported and killed massive numbers of Armenians.
A profound tragedy.
And that was immediately followed by the Turkish-Armenian War in 1920, resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands more Armenian civilians.
The vault provided no escape from the paranoid security apparatus of the Soviet Union either.
Right, Stalin's era.
Yes. In the 1940s, Joseph Stalin, who ironically enough was born in Georgia, within the Caucasus, he obsessively feared that the fiercely independent mountain populations would collaborate with invading German forces or threaten the Soviet border.
So what did he do?
The solution was a horrific feat of social engineering. Around 480,000 Chechens and Ingish, 120,000 Karachi-Balkars, along with thousands of others, were just loaded onto trains and forcibly deported en masse.
Just ripped out of their valleys.
Entirely. Sent to the frozen steppes of Central Asia and Siberia.
And our sources indicate that roughly a quarter of those deported died from starvation, disease, and exposure during the journey and the early years of exile.
It's hard to even process those numbers.
It is. It's a staggering logistical effort just to empty these valleys. And even after the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the pressure cooker didn't stop.
The lid came off, but the heat was still on.
Exactly. The sudden removal of Soviet control, combined with those ancient, distinct identities that were trapped in the acoustic foam of the valleys, it ignited a series of complex, modern territorial conflicts. You see it in Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Chechnya.
It is the great tragic paradox of the region. The mountains are formidable enough to preserve ancient, distinct identities, but they are permeable enough to allow the world's most heavily armed empires to turn those valleys into battlefields.
The geography couldn't keep the empires out.
No, it merely trapped the conflicts inside.
Man, that is incredibly heavy.
It is.
But I do want to pivot us from the darkness of human empires back to the physical landscape itself.
Oh, please do. The ecology is incredible.
It is, because the very same rugged topography that sheltered those ancient languages from conquering armies also sheltered plants and animals from what was arguably the deadliest global threat in planetary history.
Ah, the Pleistocene Ice Age.
Exactly. This is where the ecology of the Caucasus becomes truly miraculous.
It really does. Today, the region is recognized globally as one of 34 major biodiversity hotspots.
34 in the world.
Yep. It contains roughly 6,400 species of higher plants, and about a quarter of those 1,600 species are completely endemic.
Meaning they aren't found anywhere else.
Literally nowhere else on planet Earth. You have predators like the Persian leopard and the brown bear roaming alongside incredibly hyperspecific invertebrates. I mean, there are over 70 distinct species of forest snails that exist only in these specific mountain pockets.
Okay, 70 different kinds of snails just living out their isolated existence in the mountains is amazing.
It's extremely niche.
Right. But the mechanics of why they are there takes us right back to that salamander from the beginning of our deep dive. The Caucasus operated as a massive Ice Age refugium.
Right. And if we connect this to the broader mechanics of planetary climate, an Ice Age refugium acts as a geographic lifeboat.
A lifeboat?
Yeah. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, immense glacial ice sheets swept down across the northern hemisphere. The deep freeze essentially sterilized massive swaths of Europe and Asia, just completely wiping out ancient forests and the animals that relied on them.
But the Caucasus survived.
It did.
Which, okay, how does a mountain range survive a global deep freeze? You would think the elevation would make it even colder, right?
Yeah. You would think so. But it all comes down to the microclimates created by the layout of the vault.
Oh, right, the two C's.
Exactly. The towering Greater Caucasus Range acted as a massive physical shield, basically blocking the freezing Arctic winds coming down from the northern steppes. Simultaneously, you have the Black Sea to the west and the Caspian Sea to the east.
Which act like giant thermal batteries.
Spot on. They trapped heat and constantly fed warm, humid air up into the sheltered, deep valleys of the mountains.
So while the rest of the Eurasian continent was turned into this barren, frozen wasteland, these specific valleys stayed warm enough and wet enough to keep their ecosystems alive.
Exactly.
It's like the forest basically pulled a blanket over its head and waited out the apocalypse.
That is a perfect analogy. It served as the largest forest refugium in the entire Western Asian region. And because of that thermal lifeboat effect, the plants and animals we find in the Caucasus today are largely what biologists call relic species.
Relic species? It sounds a bit haunting, actually.
It is a little haunting. A relic species is essentially a living ghost.
Wow.
Yeah. It is an organism that was once widespread across a massive geographic area in an earlier geologic epoch. But now, it only survives in one isolated fragment because the rest of its habitat was destroyed.
Oh, so they used to be everywhere.
Right. So when you look at the Caucasian parsley frog, the Caucasian grouse, or that salamander we mentioned, You are looking at the survivors of a vanished world.
That is wild.
There are even plant groups in the Caucasus whose closest living genetic relatives are thousands of miles away in Eastern Asia or North America, entirely because the intermediate populations were just completely annihilated by the ice.
That is just incredible to think about. You aren't just walking through a beautiful forest, you are walking through a literal prehistoric time capsule.
Right.
The mountains held back the ice just like they held back the homogenization of languages.
They did, and that perfectly encapsulates the dual identity of the Caucasus. Well, it is a geographic vault of immense preservation, guarding the fossils of our 1.8 million-year-old ancestors, sheltering indigenous languages, and keeping an Ice Age ecology alive.
Yeah.
But that exact same vault, because of its strategic location, is also a place of immense geopolitical pressure and historical sorrow.
It really is. Which brings us full circle to our mission today.
Right?
We set out to explore how this massive natural wall between the Black and Caspian Seas shaped the destiny of Eurasia. We've seen how its towering, snow-shimmering peaks gave birth to ancient myths of gods chained to rocks and giant one-eyed shepherds.
The feedback loop of mythology.
Yes, we trace the physical mechanics of its valleys, funneling early hominins out of Africa and trapping modern languages in an acoustic foam of isolation.
Beautifully preserved.
And we examine the brutal geopolitical calculus that turned these lifeboats into choke points for Roman, Persian, Russian, and Soviet empires. And then finally, we uncovered its hidden role as an ecological fortress that literally defied a global deep freeze.
It is a region where history doesn't just happen, It accumulates.
It really does accumulate. So the next time you, the listener, see the Caucasus mentioned in the news, whether you're reading about a modern geopolitical dispute, looking at the shifting energy markets of the Caspian Sea, or watching a winter sporting event held on the slopes near Mount Elbrus, you will know exactly what you were looking at.
You'll see the whole picture.
Right. You aren't just looking at a border on a map. You are looking at a living, breathing museum of human and natural history.
I love that. And I think there is one final profound takeaway for us to consider, drawing right back to our early conversation about Mount Kaf.
Oh, the Persian myth.
Right. In Persian mythology, the peaks of the Caucasus were believed to surround the entire known world. For ancient people, looking up at that sheer, impenetrable wall of rock and ice, they decided, this is it. Nothing exists beyond this point.
It was the literal edge of reality for them.
Exactly. And I think it challenges us to look at our own lives and ask a difficult question.
Which is,
what are the modern mountains in our world, whether they are physical borders, algorithmic echo chambers, or deep-seated cultural assumptions, that we unconsciously treat as the absolute boundary of our reality? What incredible, complex realities might be surviving just on the other side of your personal Mount Kaf?
so if you were to somehow walk up to the laborers who were dragging those massive blocks of limestone across the Giza Plateau.
Right, to build the Great Pyramids.
Exactly. If you walked up to them and asked what they thought of their pharaoh, they would have probably just looked at you with complete confusion.
Oh, totally. 100%.
Because, not a single person building those iconic structures would have actually used that word for their ruler. Like, the word simply did not exist in that context yet.
Yeah, it's really funny. The title we instinctively use for these ancient rulers today is, it's a complete anachronism for the early centuries of their civilization. It's basically one of history's most successful retroactive branding campaigns.
It really is, and that's exactly why today we are taking a custom-tailored deep dive for you, the learner, into this massive, comprehensive encyclopedia of the ancient Egyptian ruler.
Yeah, we're unpacking a lot of history today.
We really are. We're pulling apart the historical record to see how, absolute power is actually constructed, how a whole civilization builds a literal god king through language, architecture, and, well, what is essentially cosmic PR.
Cosmic PR is a great way to put it. And to understand the nature of that absolute authority, the evolution of that missing word is really the perfect place to start.
Right.
Because the linguistic journey maps perfectly onto how their power became increasingly centralized over the centuries.
So let's talk about that original term, which we now pronounce as pra-ruv. It was written using two specific hieroglyphs, right?
Yeah, exactly. One symbol represented a house, and the other represented a column, which carried the meaning of, great or high.
Right, so translated literally, it just meant great house.
Exactly. It was a description of the royal palace as a physical institution,
Hmm.
like a sprawling complex of administration. It was not a living, breathing person.
Which makes sense. I mean, it functions identically to how we use the White House today.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. Like when a news anchor says the White House announced a new policy, nobody assumes the physical building grew a mouth and held a press conference.
Right, right.
It's a linguistic stand-in. It elevates the executive power residing inside the building above the individual who just happens to be holding the office at the time.
Exactly. And for centuries, that administrative geographic meaning was literally the only way the term was deployed. It just referred to the court, the treasury, the physical structures of governance.
But languages change, especially when power dynamics shift.
They do. And when we move into the New Kingdom, so we're talking roughly the 14th century BCE, around the time of Thutmose III and Akhenaten, a really profound shift occurs in the surviving texts.
Right, the term great house stops being just a place.
Exactly. It becomes a respectful form of address for the actual human being sitting on the throne.
And the earliest confirmed instance of this shift in the historical record is wild. It's a letter written directly to Akhenaten.
Yeah, it is.
The writer addresses him as great house, life, prosperity, health, the Lord. So they are essentially looking at the king and saying, you know, you are the institution.
You are the building.
Yeah.
And that transition from a physical location to a reverential epithet is crucial, but it still wasn't an official title formally attached to the royal name yet.
Oh, right. That took a while longer.
Yeah, we have to fast forward all the way to the 10th century BCE under King Siamon to see the very first dated appearance of the title Pharaoh, physically attached to a ruler's name in a religious document.
And then his successors, like Shoshenq first, kind of cemented that practice.
Yeah, exactly. They made it a permanent fixture of the royal identity.
But the evolution didn't stop there, which I find so fascinating, especially how it adapted to gender later on.
Oh, the Ptolemaic periods.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. During the Ptolemaic period, which is the era of those Greek-descended rulers that culminated with, you know, the famous Cleopatra VII, a female form of the word emerged in the texts. It was pre-3.t.
Right. And according to the research of historian Tara Sewell-Lasseter, this wasn't just a simple translation that meant female sovereign. It was much more complex than that.
How so?
Well, the way the Ptolemies utilized this female form reveals a highly specific religious and political strategy. It was used to express the concept of the royal pair ruling as a single, indivisible unit.
Oh, wow. So not just the queen on her own.
Right. The title was granted to queens regnant, like Cleopatra VII, but also to royal consorts who were not technically heads of state.
I see.
By presenting the king and queen together as a singular great house, they framed their joint rule as this unified, impenetrable front to the public. It was honestly a brilliant manipulation of an ancient term to stabilize a dynasty that was sometimes pretty precarious.
That is fascinating. And then from there, the term kind of embarked on a journey through neighboring cultures, leaving what we can almost think of as a linguistic fossil record.
Yeah, a fossil record is a great way to describe it.
Because the late Egyptian pronunciation sounded something like Pharaoh. And then the Hebrew Bible absorbed this as Paru.
Right, and the Greek translators of those texts adapted it to Pharaoh.
Exactly. Then the Quran utilizes the Arabic Quran, specifically in the context of the Exodus narrative. And finally, English translators of the King James Bible gave us the spelling Pharaoh with that distinctive H on the end that we use today.
It's amazing. That fossil record shows how a word for mud brick walls eventually became the global shorthand for ancient tyranny and divine rulership.
It really is. But I mean, if the ruler is the living embodiment of the great house of government, we have to examine the actual work taking place inside that house, right?
Oh, absolutely, because the responsibility of this office went way, way beyond managing grain yields or, settling civil disputes.
Yeah, they were basically tasked with holding the physical universe intact.
Literally. The earliest pyramid texts frame the entire political existence of the sovereign around one singular maxim, which is bring Mot and repel Isfet.
Bring Mot and repel Isfet. Okay,
Yeah.
Break those down for us.
So those two concepts are basically the foundational physics of the ancient Egyptian worldview. Mot translates roughly to cosmic order, balance, truth, harmony.
Like the predictability of the sun rising and the seasons changing.
Exactly. And Isfet is the terrifying alternative. It's chaos, injustice, violence, basically the unraveling of creation. So the pharaoh existed primarily as the mechanism to maintain Mot.
But to achieve that level of cosmic maintenance, they had to hold an absolute monopoly on power.
Like total monopoly.
Yeah.
The historical sources demonstrate a complete absence of any separation of powers, none whatsoever.
Right, because a ruler technically owned all the land in the kingdom. They enacted every law. They commanded the military.
And even more importantly, in the religious sphere, they were viewed as the only human being qualified to dialogue with the gods on an equal level.
Wow. So every priest, every scribe, and every vizier in that massive state administration was really just acting by delegation of the royal person.
Exactly. In the temple artwork spread across the entire country, the pharaoh is invariably depicted as the supreme officiant. They stand as the equal of the deities, making the necessary offerings.
And in return for these offerings, the gods activate the forces of nature for the benefit of Egypt.
Right. This theology made the rulers solely responsible for calling upon the divine forces to regulate the Nile's annual flooding, preventing famines, and stepping into the role of the sole victor who physically repels the plunderers of the desert, because those plunderers represented Isfet.
Okay, but I am stuck on the inherent danger of this arrangement.
Yeah, it's a huge risk.
Right, because if my entire political brand is that I personally negotiate with the universe to make the Nile flood, I am literally taking credit for the mechanics of nature.
You are.
So what happens during an inevitable severe drought? Like, how does a ruler survive a failing harvest when their literal job description is preventing the exact chaos? If a terrible famine hits, does the pharaoh take the heat for failing at their cosmic job?
Yes. That dynamic exposes the ultimate vulnerability of absolute power. When a ruler claims responsibility for the sunshine and the rain, they inevitably shoulder the blame for the famine and the plague.
Wow.
Now, obviously, official state records, which were essentially just royal propaganda carved in stone, they rarely advertise these failures.
Sure, they're not going to carve their own failures into a monument.
Right. But archaeological and broader historical evidence points to severe political instability, violent uprisings, and entire dynasties collapsing in direct correlation with extended periods of low Nile floods or ecological disasters.
Because if Matt was failing, the unspoken but undeniable implication was that the pharaoh was failing to repel Isfet.
Exactly. The burden of that office was immense and incredibly precarious.
So if you're carrying the weight of a precarious universe on your shoulders, you constantly need to provide intimidating, unquestionable visual proof of your authority.
Oh, big time. You need clothing and symbols that communicate your monopoly on violence and order to anyone who even looks at you.
Which brings us to the royal wardrobe. It was this collection of highly specific, religiously charged regalia. Every scepter, staff, and crown was a visual manifestation of authority.
And a lot of those designs dated all the way back to prehistoric, pre-dynastic Egypt.
The scepters alone tell such a complex story of how they viewed governance. You have the Heka scepter, which is that classic curved shepherd's crook, right? Symbolizing the ruler guiding and nurturing their flock.
Right. And then you have the Was scepter, which is a long, straight staff topped with an animal head, representing raw power and dominion.
And we often see the ruler depicted holding the crook crossed over their chest, paired with the flail, an agricultural tool used to thresh grain.
Yeah, it's all about providing and protecting. But then, resting right on the forehead was the uraeus, the rearing cobra.
Ah, the cobra.
And the uraeus was not just some passive badge of office. According to the religious texts, this cobra possessed agency. It actively protected the king by literally spitting fire at the enemies of the state.
Oh, wow. So it was like a lethal divine security detail projecting outward from the ruler's mind.
Exactly. But honestly, the most elaborate visual branding strategy was the headgear. The various crowns functioned as, like, wearable maps of the ruler's political and spiritual domain.
Because the geography of Egypt is so heavily divided between that lush, spreading river delta in the north and the narrow, harsh river valley in the south.
Right, and the crowns reflected that tension perfectly.
You had the Dishret, which was the red crown of Lower Egypt in the north, and the Hedjet, the white crown of Upper Egypt in the south.
And when those two culturally distinct lands were united into one empire, the state didn't just pick one crown. They physically nested the white crown inside the red crown to create the Shent, the double crown.
It's like a daily physical assertion of a forced, fragile unity.
Exactly. And the headgear diversified based on the specific era and the ritual occasion, too. Like, a ruler might wear the neems, that iconic striped cloth kerchief we immediately recognize from the solid gold death mask of Tutankhamun.
Right, the classic King Tut look.
Yeah. And in religious contexts, they might wear the Atef crown, which resembled the white crown, but was flanked by these elaborate ostrich feathers and topped with a gold disc.
Which deeply associated the wearer with Osiris, the god of the afterlife.
Precisely. And then during the New Kingdom, the Kepresh, or the blue crown, became prominent, frequently depicted in scenes of the ruler actively engaging in battle.
Okay, so we have thousands of statues, detailed relief carvings, and vivid paintings depicting these rulers wearing these intricate, towering crowns.
We do.
Yet, and this is wild, the Egyptologist Bob Breyer points out an astonishing physical reality in the archaeological record. Not a single authentic ancient Egyptian crown has ever been discovered.
It is wild. It remains a profound mystery in the field. I mean, think about when Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in the 1920s.
Aye.
He found an undisturbed burial chamber packed to the ceiling with gold artifacts, disassembled chariots, royal regalia like the crook and flail, Yet among all those treasures, there was no crown.
Not a single one.
Nope. The king was buried with intricate diadems, but none of the great crowns of state accompanied him into eternity.
Which feels crazy to me. It's like finding the British monarch's tomb packed with priceless art, but completely missing the crown jewels.
That is a great comparison.
But Breyer's theory on this absence actually makes perfect logical sense.
It really does.
Because if these specific hats were buried with every passing ruler, the state would run out of their most potent magical artifacts pretty quickly.
Exactly. These crowns were not the personal property of the individual who just happened to be wearing them. They belonged to the eternal institution of the state.
Right. They were imbued with such deep religious magic that they had to be physically passed to the successor to ensure the uninterrupted continuation of Mott.
Right. The crown is the institution, and the human is merely its temporary vehicle.
Wow.
And this institutional absorption of the individual extended far beyond just the physical crowns and into the very identity of the ruler. I mean, a personal name given at birth was completely insufficient for a living god.
Yeah, they needed an upgrade.
Big time. By the time of the Middle Kingdom, the official identity of the ruler expanded into the five-name titulary, which was this elaborate sequence they adopted the absolute moment they took the throne.
Okay, I am looking at the mechanics of this naming convention, and it just seems incredibly exhausting. Like, why wasn't just claiming to be the supreme ruler enough? Why did they need to keep tacking on new titles until a single introduction required 5 distinct names?
Well, you have to remember, the five-name titulary was the ultimate exercise in political coalition building.
Okay, how so?
The kingdom was vast, incorporating numerous regional deities, competing priesthoods, and distinct geographical identities. The titulary was a deliberate strategy to absorb every potential source of opposition into the ruler's own identity.
Oh, that's smart. So the first of these is the Horus name, which is the oldest in the sequence, right?
Yes. It is written inside a square, fortified frame called a Serek.
And the Serek is literally a drawing of the palace facade.
Exactly. This name declared the king as the earthly incarnation of the falcon god Horus, residing within the Great House.
Okay. And then the second is the Nesu-Bidi name, introduced during the First Dynasty. This title is accompanied by 2 specific biological symbols, the sedge and the bee.
Right. The sedge is a resilient reed native to the southern river valley, representing Upper Egypt. And the bee symbolizes the fertile agricultural delta of Lower Egypt in the north.
So the title translates functionally to He of the Sedge and the Bee, or King of Upper and Lower Egypt.
Yep, binding those 2 historically tense regions right to his person.
Then third is the Nebdi name, meaning the 2 ladies. This name linked the ruler to Nekbet, the vulture goddess of Upper Egypt, and Wadjet, the cobra goddess of Lower Egypt.
Right. And the fourth name is the Golden Horus, which features the falcon god perched on the hieroglyphic symbol for gold.
Because gold was considered the flesh of the gods, since it never tarnishes.
Exactly. So this name served to permanently assert the ruler's divine, eternal status. Right. And these are the names modern people are usually the most familiar with, because they are the ones enclosed in those famous cartouches.
And a cartouche is not just a decorative oval, right? It's a depiction of a loop of rope tied with a knot.
Yes, representing a magical barrier that offers eternal protection to the name trapped inside. The praenomen was the throne name, often incorporating the name of the supreme sun god, Re.
And the nomen was the birth name, but upon taking the throne, it was preceded by the epithet son of Re.
Exactly. So by embedding the dominant gods and the entirety of the national geography into their daily signature, The pharaoh made it ideologically impossible to separate the ruler from the state.
Because to rebel against the throne was to rebel against the sun, the soil, and the physical order of the universe itself.
You nailed it.
It's just wild. You take a mundane building, give it a cosmic job description, dress it in magical crowns of forced unity, and grant it 5 names encompassing the entire physical world. I mean, the inevitable culmination of this process is the staggering claim of actual divinity.
Oh, absolutely. And when we examine how neighboring contemporary cultures reacted to this specific flavor of extreme propaganda, the friction is palpable.
I can imagine.
Yeah, taking a broader view of the ancient Near East really highlights just how extreme the Egyptian concept of divine kingship truly was. Like in the powerful Sumerian city-states of Mesopotamia, kings were viewed as vital mediators between the heavens and the earth.
Right, but they were fundamentally mortal.
Exactly. Even the legendary King Gilgamesh, despite his divine parentage and immense power, is ultimately a tragic figure whose core narrative is his failure to achieve immortality.
He is painfully human.
Very much so. But the Egyptian state, however, pushed the narrative entirely past human limitations.
Yeah, their PR machine practically erased their humanity. During the early dynastic period, they were the literal incarnation of Horus walking the earth.
Right.
And by the time of King Geoffrey in the 26th century BCE, the state began promoting the narrative that the ruler practically ceased to have a human father at all.
Yeah, the official story became that the Queen Mother was magically impregnated by the solar deity Ra. Some texts even claim the king was fashioned before the sky or the earth had even been created.
It's such a profound assertion of supremacy. And it provoked some pretty intense, sometimes baffled reactions from later historical traditions that encountered these monumental claims.
Oh, for sure. The classical Greek historians really struggled to synthesize this concept.
Like Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, he seemed to support the idea that the Egyptian rulers received legitimate divine honors.
Right. But Herodotus flat out denied the premise. He claimed the Egyptian priests themselves rejected the notion that their human kings were actual gods.
Which makes sense for a Greek perspective. The Greek cultural framework featured gods who were immortal but deeply flawed, and humans who were brilliant but definitively mortal. They couldn't easily accommodate a human claiming unyielding cosmic divinity.
Exactly. But honestly, the most severe, systematic deconstruction of this divine hubris emerges from rabbinic literature.
Oh, I love this part.
So good. These ancient scholars and commentators looked back at the pharaoh not as a misguided monarch, but as the ultimate tragicomic cautionary tale of human arrogance.
The takedown in these texts, specifically in the Midrashic writings, which are ancient rabbinic commentaries on the Hebrew scriptures, is just brutal in its poetic justice.
Brutal and hilarious.
Yes. The texts describe the pharaoh hubristically looking at the Nile River and claiming to have created it, just boasting that he is the sole owner and architect of the water that gives Egypt life.
Right. And the book of Exodus features a direct divine mockery of this claim.
Oh.
God responds to the pharaoh's boast of owning the river by bringing a devastating plague of frogs directly out of that very same river.
It's incredible. The source of his supposed divine creation becomes the exact instrument of his agricultural destruction.
Exactly. And the Midrashic commentators push the critique even further.
This is the bestie too.
They describe the pharaoh as a deeply heretical figure who presented himself to his subjects as a self-created lord of the universe who didn't require sustenance or suffer human weakness. But the rabbinic writers expose the absurdity of this illusion by pointing out the most mundane biological reality. They write that the pharaoh's grand claims of divinity were consistently exposed early every morning, because a god who claims not to need food or produce waste
still has to sneak down to the reeds of the Nile River to use the bathroom in secret.
Exactly. It's so humbling.
It really is. Stripping away the 5 majestic names, removing the magical crowns that must be surrendered at death, and looking past the towering palace walls basically leaves you with a fragile human being who needs to use the river just like the laborers building the pyramids.
Perfectly said. One culture's ultimate symbol of cosmic order becomes another culture's lasting lesson on the absurdity of human arrogance.
It perfectly captures the duality of this ancient institution, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, we see a masterful, centuries-long construction of absolute authority that successfully stabilized and governed a massive empire. But simultaneously, it's an institution built on claims so precariously grand that they invited inevitable ridicule the exact moment the military and ecological power backing them began to wane.
So, for you, the learner listening to this deep dive, the evolution of the Egyptian ruler is not just some piece of ancient trivia. It is a true masterclass in how authority is manufactured and maintained.
Absolutely.
Because when modern political leaders mandate specific symbolism, or when they deliver speeches carefully framed by imposing state architecture,
Or when they adopt expansive titles to project strength and unity.
exactly, they're executing a strategy perfected thousands of years ago on the banks of the Nile. The core objective remains identical. Convince the public that the person standing at the podium is the only force capable of holding back the chaos.
Yeah, the technological methods of projecting that power have obviously evolved exponentially, but the fundamental human desire to seek order and stability in the form of an absolute, unquestioned authority, that remains a constant thread running through all of human civilization.
It really does. So if the ancient Egyptians relied on their unburied magical crowns, their venomous scepters, and their five-part names to project their cosmic power, it forces us to look pretty closely at the theater of modern governance.
It certainly does.
What are the invisible magical crowns that our leaders wear today that convince us they are the only ones standing between order and the complete collapse of the universe?
That is a very vital question to keep in mind the next time the Great House makes an announcement.
It really is. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We'll see you next time.
Picture a patch of wetland, right in the heart of the Congo Basin.
Okay.
It covers just like 4% of the surrounding area.
Which is pretty tiny in the grand scheme of things.
Right, it's tiny. But buried underneath that relatively small swamp is this layer of incredibly dense peat, and it's holding 30 billion tons of carbon,
Wow. Yeah, 30 billion.
which is, it's the equivalent of all the carbon stored in every single tree across the other 96% of the entire basin combined.
It's staggering when you actually look at the numbers.
It really is. And if the global climate shifts just enough to, dry it out, that tiny 4% patch of land turns into a 30 billion ton compost bomb.
Releasing the equivalent of, well, basically 3 years of total global human carbon emissions.
Yeah.
Just from one single highly localized area.
Today, for you listening, our mission is to understand the actual mechanics behind scenarios exactly like that one. We're going on a deep dive into tipping points in the Earth's climate system.
And it's such an important topic right now.
Exactly. And the goal here isn't to, induce panic or make you doom scroll through the audio. Our objective is to give you a clear, mechanically grounded understanding of the physics and the biology driving all these headlines you see.
Right, because there's a lot of noise out there.
There is. So we're going to demystify what a tipping point actually is. We'll trace the specific vulnerabilities scattered across Earth's ice, oceans, and forests. And then we'll look at the terrifyingly fascinating ways these massive planetary systems interact with each other.
The stakes for understanding this architecture are just immense. I mean, a major 2022 study in the journal Science established that exceeding just 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming above pre-industrial levels, that is, could trigger multiple tipping points simultaneously.
Simultaneously, wow.
Yeah, we're looking at the potential collapse of major ice sheets, the abrupt thawing of permafrost, and, the wholesale transformation of rainforests.
Right.
But the key to grasping this isn't just knowing what might change. It's understanding why these massive planetary systems can transition so radically and often irreversibly.
Okay, let's unpack this because the term tipping point gets thrown around constantly, right?
Absolutely, all the time.
And usually with this implication of an overnight catastrophe, like pushing a glass off the edge of a table.
Right, the classic analogy.
Yeah, 1 second it's fine, then the next second it's just shattered on the floor. But the physics of a planetary climate tipping point operate a bit differently, don't they?
Yep.
If we cross a tipping point today, the world doesn't literally change tomorrow.
Very differently, yeah. The glass falling off the table is actually a pretty misleading visual.
Really? How so?
Because it conflates the trigger with the transition. So in climate mathematics, a much better way to visualize a tipping point is, well, imagine bending a thick piece of industrial plastic.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
If you apply pressure to it, it bends, and if you let go, it just snaps right back to its original shape.
Which would be like a resilient climate system.
Exactly. But if you bend that plastic past a very specific invisible angle, Its yield point, the internal molecular structure, fundamentally alters.
Ah, so even when you stop applying pressure, it doesn't snap back.
Right. It has permanently found a new deformed state. We call that bifurcation-induced tipping.
Bifurcation-induced tipping. Okay, so crossing the threshold just locks in the destination. The speed at which it bends, or, the ice melts, is a completely separate timeline.
That distinction is paramount. The moment you push past that structural yield point, the tipping point is officially crossed.
But the transition takes a while.
Yeah, the actual physical transition into the new state might take decades, centuries, or even millennia. I mean, the Greenland ice sheet could cross the temperature threshold that essentially dooms it within our own lifetimes, but the sheer mass of the ice will take thousands of years to physically melt away.
So the trigger happens now, but the transition plays out over generations.
Exactly, unless, of course, we've done the plastic too fast.
Wait, what happens then?
Which brings us to rate-induced tipping. This occurs when the environmental conditions change so rapidly that the system simply cannot adapt or migrate to keep up.
So it just breaks.
Essentially, yes. Even if the absolute temperature hasn't reached that theoretical yield point yet, the sheer velocity of the warming forces a sudden shift. It's the difference between slowly pushing a piece of plastic until it deforms and violently bending it so fast that it just snaps in half.
Wow. Okay. So now that we have a grasp on the underlying math of the deformation of the system, let's look at the first major physical structures feeling that pressure.
The cryosphere.
Right, Earth's ice.
Yeah.
Because these are universally considered the first potential dominoes to fall. Let's start with Greenland. Why is a block of ice that massive, so inherently fragile?
Well, it comes down to a localized atmospheric mechanism called the melt elevation feedback.
Melt elevation feedback. Okay, break that down for me.
Think of the Greenland ice sheet as essentially a continent-sized mountain made entirely of ice. It reaches miles into the sky, and atmospheric physics dictate that air at higher altitudes is colder than air at lower altitudes.
Right, like hiking up a mountain, it gets colder at the top.
Exactly.
Which means as global warming melts the top surface of the ice sheet, the overall height of that ice mountain physically drops.
And as the altitude of the surface drops, that surface is now sitting in lower, warmer air.
Oh, I see.
So the warmer air accelerates the melting process, which drops the elevation even further, plunging the surface into even warmer air.
It's a self-feeding loop.
It is a self-feeding, inescapable loop. The ice sheet literally shrinks itself down into a warmer climate.
That is wild. And researchers actually found physical evidence that this exact feedback loop has tipped before, didn't they?
They did, yeah. It's fascinating.
From what I read in the sources, they drilled a 1.4-kilometer ice core in Greenland. And by analyzing the subglacial sediment at the very bottom, they discovered that the ice sheet melted away entirely at least once in the last million years.
Which proves it's a proven vulnerability.
Right.
It suggests the threshold for complete collapse is highly sensitive, potentially even lower than the maximum global temperatures the Earth reached during that previous interglacial period.
Okay, so let's travel to the opposite pole, down to the West Antarctic ice sheet, or WAIS, as it's called.
Yeah.
The architecture here is completely different from Greenland, right?
Completely different. The ice there is over 4 kilometers thick in places, but it's sitting on bedrock that is mostly submerged below sea level.
Wait, hold on. If the bedrock is below sea level, that means the ocean can literally get underneath the ice sheet and melt it from the bottom up. Is that why it's a runaway effect?
It's even more dramatic than that. The ocean water doesn't just get underneath, it fundamentally destabilizes the structural anchor.
How does it do that?
Well, over millions of years, the unimaginable weight of that 4-kilometer thick block of ice actually compressed the Earth's crust. It created a deep subglacial basin.
So the ice is sitting in a bowl.
Essentially resting in a massive underwater bowl, yeah. And the specific location where the ice detaches from the bedrock and begins floating on the ocean's surface, that's called the grounding line.
Right, the grounding line. And because that grounding line is sitting on a downward slope leading to the bottom of the bowl, any melting pushes it backward into deeper water.
Exactly. Warm ocean currents erode the edge of the ice, forcing the grounding line to retreat. And because of the bowl's slope, retreating means moving into deeper water.
And deeper water means more of the ice is exposed.
Yes. Deeper water exposes a taller cliff face of ice to the ocean heat. That increased exposure causes it to melt faster, which pushes the grounding line even further down the slope.
It just keeps feeding itself.
It's a mechanism called marine ice sheet instability. Once that grounding line starts retreating down the incline, gravity and thermodynamics basically guarantee a self-sustaining, irreversible collapse.
Wow. Okay, before we move on from the ice,
Yeah.
there's a vital nuance regarding the Arctic Sea that we should cover, because we constantly see headlines about summer Arctic sea ice disappearing. But mechanically, that is not currently classified as a tipping point. Why is that?
Because a tipping point requires a transition into a new, irreversible, stable state.
Okay.
The loss of summer sea ice in the Arctic is ecologically devastating, sure, and it absorbs massive amounts of solar heat because dark water reflects less sunlight than white ice.
Right, the albedo effect.
Exactly. But the long, dark Arctic winter is still profoundly cold. It's cold enough that the ice can recover and refreeze every single year.
So the system bends, but it bounces back.
Right. It hasn't reached bifurcation.
But the Barents Sea has.
Yes, the Barents Sea is the crucial exception here. It is warming at an astonishing rate, up to 7 times faster than the global average.
7 times. That's insane.
It is. The water there is absorbing so much heat during the summer months that the winter temperatures are no longer sufficient to extract that heat and refreeze the surface.
So the winter ice just doesn't come back.
We are looking at the permanent loss of winter ice. That is a true tipping point. The system loses its ability to bounce back entirely.
Okay, so all this melting ice from Greenland and the Barents Sea, it doesn't just raise sea levels and vanish. It pours trillions of tons of fresh water directly into the North Atlantic Ocean.
A massive influx of fresh water, yeah.
And that fundamentally alters the fluid dynamics of the planet.
Which brings us to the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation.
The AMOC is arguably the most critical cardiovascular system on Earth.
Cardiovascular system, I like that.
It really is. It is a staggering global conveyor belt of water, and it's driven entirely by differences in water density.
Let's map out that plumbing system for everyone listening. It starts at the equator, right?
Roughly, yes. So the sun beats down on the tropical Atlantic, heating the water. And that warm surface water is carried north by currents like the Gulf Stream toward Europe.
Right, moving the heat north.
But as it travels north toward the Arctic, 2 things happen. First, it cools down in the frigid air. Second, a lot of the water evaporates, but the salt stays behind.
The salt concentration goes
That's-
way up.
So by the time this water reaches the coast of Greenland, it is extremely cold and intensely salty.
And in oceanography, cold and salty means heavy.
Right, dense.
Very dense. That incredibly dense water sinks deep into the ocean abyss. This massive, continuous sinking action in the North Atlantic acts like a colossal pump.
Pulling everything else along with it.
Exactly.
Right.
As millions of cubic meters of dense water plunge to the ocean floor, it creates a void at the surface, which physically pulls more warm tropical water north to replace it. That downwelling is the engine that keeps the entire global conveyor belt moving.
Okay, so now introduce the melt elevation feedback of Greenland that we just talked about.
Yeah.
You are suddenly dumping astronomical volumes of fresh, highly buoyant meltwater directly into that downwelling zone,
Yes. You are severely diluting the salinity of the North Atlantic.
like watering down a hearty soup.
That's a great way to put it. The water becomes fresher, which means it becomes lighter. It loses the density required to sink.
And if the water stops sinking, the pump stalls.
The conveyor belt grinds to a halt.
If that plumbing system shuts down, what happens to the heat distribution of the planet?
The thermal balance goes into shock. Without that conveyor belt bringing tropical heat north, parts of Europe could experience up to 10 degrees Celsius of rapid cooling.
10 degrees, that's a massive shift.
It would be devastating. Arable farming in places like Britain or Scandinavia could become economically impossible, but the global impact is far more severe than just Europe getting cold.
What else happens?
The AMOC dictates the position of the intertropical convergence zone.
Which is the thermal equator, right?
Right, the thermal equator that drives the planet's major monsoon systems. If the AMOC stalls, that rain belt shifts drastically southward.
Oh, wow.
Billions of people in West Africa, South America, and India who rely on those monsoons for agriculture would face unprecedented drought.
And we are seeing early signs of this exact same dynamic at the South Pole, too.
We are, unfortunately.
Antarctic meltwater is pouring into the Southern Ocean, freshening the water there and disrupting the southern overturning circulation. So the dense Antarctic bottom water is being diluted, weakening the lower, deeper ocean currents while the upper wind-driven cells actually strengthen.
The planetary engines at both poles are simultaneously sputtering.
All connected.
It is. Now, while a total collapse of the AMOC is currently considered unlikely to happen within this century, the physics dictate a severe weakening regardless. Current projections estimate a slowdown of 24 to 39%.
So the ocean conveyor belt weakens, the heat distribution of the planet gets lopsided, and that directly displaces the tropical rain belt.
Right, exactly.
Suddenly, the rainfall that terrestrial ecosystems rely on is happening somewhere else, which takes us out of the water and directly into the world's most vital forests, the Amazon rainforest.
Yes, the Amazon.
The scale of the Amazon is difficult to comprehend, but the biological engineering is even more staggering. I mean, the Amazon literally generates half of its own rainfall.
It operates as a continent-sized biological water pump through a process called evapotranspiration.
Evapotranspiration.
Okay.
How does that work?
Well, the billions of trees in the Amazon absorb groundwater through their roots and transpire it out through their leaves as water vapor.
Like the forest is sweating.
Basically, yes. And this massive release of moisture into the atmosphere creates immense, localized, low-pressure systems. Those low-pressure systems physically suck in more moist air from the Atlantic Ocean.
It's incredible.
The moisture condenses, falls as rain, waters the next section of the forest, and the trees pump it right back into the air.
It is a self-sustaining weather machine.
Yeah.
But 20% of the Amazon has already been systematically deforested, right?
Which critically damages the pump. If enough forest is removed, whether through direct human deforestation or climate-driven drought, the evapotranspiration cycle falters.
The trees stop sweating enough moisture.
Exactly. The low-pressure suction drops, and the downwind regions simply stop receiving rain. The forest dries out, triggering a massive dieback.
So it just dies off.
The complex, layered rainforest canopy collapses, and the ecosystem transitions into a degraded, dry savanna. And once the biological pump is gone, a savanna cannot generate enough moisture to ever transition back into a rainforest.
The plastic has permanently snapped into a new shape.
Precisely.
That structural transformation is terrifying. Which brings us back to that visceral hidden detail we discussed at the very beginning of the deep dive, the cuvette central peatlands in the Congo Basin.
Right, the compost bomb. This represents one of the most volatile rate-induced tipping points on land.
Just remind us, what exactly are peatlands?
Peatlands are essentially waterlogged bogs where dead plant matter accumulates over thousands of years, but doesn't fully decompose because it's submerged in water, cut off from oxygen.
So it's a massive carbon vault.
Yes.
30 billion tons of carbon locked in just 4% of the Congo Basin's area.
But the local climate surrounding the Cuvette Centrale is already dangerously close to the limit of what can sustain a wetland. It is significantly drier than the peatlands in the Amazon or Southeast Asia.
Okay, so what happens if it crosses that limit?
If shifting global rain patterns or increased temperatures dry this swamp out, the water table drops. The peat is suddenly exposed to oxygen.
And when oxygen hits thousands of years of undecomposed organic matter, the microbes wake up.
Aerobic bacteria begin breaking down the peat at an explosive rate. This microbial frenzy releases staggering amounts of carbon dioxide and methane directly into the atmosphere.
Just a massive release.
And the decomposition process itself generates intense heat, which dries the surrounding peat even further, sometimes causing the ground to literally spontaneously combust. It becomes a compost bomb.
Wow. And we have an even larger version of that compost bomb sitting in high latitudes, don't we? The Arctic permafrost.
We do. The permafrost holds roughly twice as much carbon as is currently circulating in our entire atmosphere.
Twice as much.
As the Arctic warms, the frozen ground thaws, the dormant microbes wake up, and they begin feasting on the organic matter, venting methane, which is profoundly more potent than CO2 into the air.
Which dramatically accelerates the very warming that sawed the ground in the first place.
Exactly.
You know, this isn't just a list of isolated regional problems. We aren't looking at separate files in a cabinet here. This is a single, heavily interconnected engine. What happens when we zoom out and look at the causality between all these systems?
You're touching on the frontier of current climate research right now. Cascading tipping points.
Cascading tipping points. So dominoes.
Exactly. Through advanced network model analysis, we can map how crossing a threshold in one specific element fundamentally alters the physical environment of another element, pushing it past its own yield point.
Trace that cascade for me. How did the dominoes actually fall?
Well, let's start at the top. Global temperatures rise, pushing the Greenland ice sheet past its melt elevation threshold.
Okay.
Greenland melts, pouring billions of tons of fresh water into the North Atlantic. That fresh water dilutes the salinity, which stalls the downwelling pump of the AMOC ocean current.
Right, the conveyor belt stops.
With the ocean conveyor belt crippled, global heat and rainfall patterns shift drastically.
The thermal equator moves south.
Exactly. This new altered atmospheric circulation starves the Amazon rainforest of moisture, triggering a dieback that turns the biological pump into a dry savanna.
Okay, so the Amazon is down. What about the north?
Simultaneously, the stalled ocean currents trap warmer water in the higher latitudes instead of dispersing it, which accelerates the thawing of the Arctic permafrost.
Oh, wow.
The permafrost and the drying peatlands release massive vaults of ancient carbon and methane into the atmosphere.
Which supercharges the global greenhouse effect, making the planet even hotter, which melts whatever is left of the ice even faster. It's a closed-loop planetary chain reaction.
It really is. And this network of interactions exposes a massive flaw in how we often discuss climate targets.
What do you mean?
Well, policymakers frequently rely on the idea of a temporary overshoot. The logic assumes we might briefly surpass 1.5 degrees of warming, but later, using advanced carbon capture technology, we'll just pull carbon out of the air and bring the temperature back down to a safe level.
Like an undo button. But the math of a tipping cascade doesn't allow for an undo button, does it?
Not at all. Network models reveal that even a temporary overshoot increases the risk of triggering these irreversible tipping cascades by up to 72%.
72% just from a temporary overshoot.
Yes, because once you bend the plastic past its yield point, it doesn't matter if you subsequently remove the pressure. The internal structure has already transformed.
The damage is done.
Once the fresh water stalls the AMOC, pulling carbon out of the air 50 years later won't jumpstart the ocean currents again. The cascade has a memory.
So, synthesizing this journey for everyone listening, we started by understanding the fundamental physics of bifurcation, how stability is slowly eroded until a system seeks a new state.
Right.
We looked at the self-shrinking ice mountains of Greenland and the vulnerable subglacial bowls of Antarctica. We traced that melting water into the Atlantic, watching it dilute the dense, salty downwelling pump that drives our global weather.
The AMOC.
And we saw how a stalled ocean stops the biological water pumps of the Amazon while waking up the microbial compost bombs in the Congo and the Arctic. It is a staggering mechanical web.
It highlights the sheer scale of the Earth system. But if we connect this all back to you listening, the most important takeaway is actually buried in the timelines we established at the very beginning.
The difference between the trigger and the transition.
Yes. The triggers for these thresholds might be crossed in the near term, but the physical transitions, the complete melting of the ice sheets, the total transformation of the rainforests play out over decades, centuries, or even millennia.
So there's still time.
The speed and severity of those transitions are entirely dependent on how much pressure we continue to apply. Human agency is the defining variable here. The emissions decisions made in this current decade dictate the absolute maximum temperature the system experiences, which directly determines exactly how many of these systems are pushed past their yield point.
We are entirely in control of how hard we bend the plastic. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought regarding the absolute extreme limits of our climate.
Okay.
When discussing tipping points, there is a popular apocalyptic scenario that gets brought up a lot, the idea that human emissions could push Earth into a runaway greenhouse effect, turning us into a replica of Venus, where the oceans literally boil and evaporate into space.
It's the ultimate catastrophic visualization, for sure.
But mechanically, it is a localized impossibility. According to atmospheric physics and the data analyzed in these sources, a Venus-style runaway greenhouse effect has virtually zero chance of being triggered by human activity.
Yeah, no chance.
Basically zero. For Earth's climate to physically boil the oceans, the sun itself would need to naturally brighten by tens of percents. Astrophysically, that stellar evolution won't happen for another 600 to 700 million years.
That's a relief, at least. Earth's climate is exquisitely sensitive, and we can absolutely push it into a state that is deeply hostile to human agriculture, coastal infrastructure, and the global economy. But the laws of physics prevent us from turning it into Venus.
We aren't going to boil the oceans into space. The planet will remain. The only question is what kind of internal equilibrium it settles into. Something to ponder as you look up at the clouds today, realizing that every single system, from the ice to the ocean currents to the sweating leaves of the rainforest, is connected by an invisible thread.